Welcome to Lawyer and Layman Explaining. This is a show where we discuss topics related to law and social justice from the perspective of a layperson who gets all of their law education from Reddit and other social media online, and
someone who can tell you what's true and what's false about the portrayal of law firm life in The Good Wife. Excellent show, by the way. Before we dive into our episode, quick disclaimer. This podcast is for educational purposes only and is not intended to provide any legal advice. If you need legal advice, you might want to pause this podcast and find a lawyer.
but then please come back.
Any inaccuracies are unintentional and facts could change at any time. Do your own research. Today we're going to talk about a really small group of people that get to do whatever they want and have the power to make your life really difficult if you live in the United States. That's right. We're talking about the United States Supreme Court.
Gosh, I was going to say that could be any number of groups.
I thought you might think it was a fairly broad description, especially in today's times. Martin, when you think Supreme Court, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
Ooh, the very first thing, black robes, although I don't think that's exclusive to the Supreme Court. I think gavels, I think big marble halls. Yeah.
That's all fair. That's totally fair. So a lot of today's episode is going to be very basic stuff for our listeners that are lawyers, especially litigators, folks that argue in court. This episode is for A, folks new to the United States who may not be familiar with how the Supreme Court works, and B, folks who have grown up in the United States and have heard the term Supreme Court, but aren't exactly sure what those folks do, who they are. For folks that eat, sleep, and breathe all things Supreme Court, let us know if you have anything to add to our episode today. Martin, why are you, as our resident layman, interested in the Supreme Court?
That's a good one. Nowadays, being that we're in the year of our Lord, 2024, I think we've seen, as laymen, we've seen a lot of headlines of some, excuse my language, some crazy shit happening on the Supreme Court. Yeah, as laymen, we definitely need to be concerned about what the Supreme Court does. It has an unwieldy amount of power and influence over our lives, our rights. Yeah, it's the ultimate court where laws are interpreted or enforced or adjudicated.
Yeah, I think those are very good reasons to be interested in the Supreme Court. And you're pointing out just how much of an influence the things that this small group of people have over our daily lives, our everyday lives. In this episode, we aren't going to be talking about the history of the Supreme Court, the when it started, the why it started, who got to be on the first court, etc. We're not talking about that today. How does that sound, Martin?
That sounds like we've got a workout cut out for us. There's a lot to discuss.
That's right. All right, so some of the questions we'll cover today have right answers, according to the resources I used to prepare for this episode, which we'll provide links to. And to make things a little more fun, because we know that Martin is a major Jeopardy head, for many of the questions that have a right answer, as in not just Martin's opinion or feeling, I'm going to ask Martin the question and have him respond in the style of Jeopardy, in the form of a question.
What is in the form of a question? Sorry.
Excellent.
I was hitting the buzzer.
You're ready. You're already ready. Hit the ground running. I'll also announce my totally made up and arbitrary point value for each question. And then at the end, we'll tally up how many points Martin gets. Martin, thoughts on this approach?
I love it. This is a surprise. I didn't know this was happening. I'm super excited. Not only am I a law nerd, I definitely am a Jeopardy nerd. So, yeah, I'm excited to get into it.
Let's begin. Martin, for 200 points, why is it called Supreme Court?
It's an interesting question. What is, because it's the highest court in the land, the nation? It's an interesting question.
Okay. I will actually give you the 200 points because your average layperson does not know the constitutional language that established the Supreme Court, but it gets at exactly that spirit, which is the highest court in the land. I'll read you the exact language. Article 3 of the Constitution establishes the federal judiciary. And Article 3, Section 1 states that the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. And I'm reading this language. I found it on uscourts.gov, although we know Martin has his pocket constitution and there's other places where you can find this text. Martin, hearing this constitutional language, what do you think?
It's always fascinating when I guess it's the evolution of words. And I guess I wouldn't have thought that the founders writing the Constitution used the exact phrase Supreme Court. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I think that is often an issue with interpreting the Constitution. I guess constitutional law probably is, what was their intent in using this word? What does it mean? I also think it's kind of funny that the founders like, yes, we need one Supreme Court. And then, as we'll talk about in one of the later episodes, I guess, whoever decided to found the Supreme Court was like, yes, we'll call it the Supreme Court.
I mean, why change a good thing, right? If it's broke, don't fix. So, listeners, if you're keeping track, Martin got the 200 points. So,
Score.
Wonderful. Also, fun fact, I had a professor in law school that called the Supreme Court the Supremes. And now I can't help but picture the judges singing, "Someday We'll Be Together." Also, side note, listeners, if you haven't heard of the Supremes, after this episode, go listen. Martin, when did this become a music podcast? First, the Stevie Wonder reference in the last episode, and now this.
I think it was always a music podcast at its heart. Given that we're the host, I don't think it couldn't have happened any other way.
Good point. Very good point. So next up, we'll talk about the sort of basic functions of the Supreme Court. What is it? What does it do? This is not a Jeopardy question because there's lots of different ways to answer this. But Martin, if you were to sort of distill what you think the Supreme Court is and what it does, what are your thoughts?
Oh, man. I feel like I could put on a couple of different layman hats and answer this question. But yeah, I mean, essentially, they're the last arbiter of the law. When cases get decided and appealed, eventually, I think through some process they make it to the Supreme Court, and I think it's up to them to ultimately interpret it and kind of give that final legal judgment. In theory, in practice, there's probably a lot of ways they can go with making some jokes, cracking some jokes on what the Supreme Court actually does. But I think in theory, they're like that final arbiter of justice, to use a phrase that wasn't common parlance.
I think that's a pretty fair summary. I will sort of spell out a couple things, but they relate very much to how you've well articulated what the court does. The what does it do part of the question can also be phrased as what is its jurisdiction or its authority to hear arguments and make decisions in cases. There is a small subset of cases for which the court has something called original jurisdiction. Martin, are you familiar with that term or any guesses on what it means?
No idea what that term means. I assume it's probably pertains to like issues that naturally don't fall anywhere else or would only fall to the Supreme Court. Like it only makes sense for the Supreme Court to weigh in on.
Okay. If I could offer a meme that would be responsive to that answer, it would be the J-Lo standing up and clapping, looking impressed, because that's very close to what original jurisdiction is. It means that the case can come exclusively before the Supreme Court. So let's say our beloved state of Oregon had beef with Texas and filed a lawsuit. Gasp. That suit would come before the Supreme Court. Also, cases involving ambassadors have to be brought straight to Roberts and them, which is my new nickname for the Supreme Court, maybe. So now that you have some examples, does the original jurisdiction term kind of make sense? I mean, I think you kind of already intuited it, but does it make more sense now?
Yeah, kind of. I was kind of curious about what the actual definition was in terms of like, why they used original jurisdiction. I mean, I guess for me, when I hear original jurisdiction, I feel like it would be like the original intention of the creation of the court, which was to settle these matters. Like as the example you use, like between two states, there's no, each state has their own court system. Who is the referee, when they go to battle? It makes
Right.
sense. That's kind of the original intention of the Supreme Court, is to settle those like federal level issues.
That are not suited for another court. Right.
Right. Yeah, it's also, I mean, you kind of take a look at like the context of the history of our country too, like ambassadors. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Like especially way back in the day when we were a young fledgling country, uh, that's probably a more of a common issue than we would see nowadays. But I guess I don't know. So yeah, I guess it kind of makes sense. But given in the context of like history, it seems like nowadays, like that doesn't seem like what the courts deal with, or at least what we read in the headlines or what they deal with.
So you're alluding to the other form of jurisdiction that the court has, which is appellate jurisdiction. And that is jurisdiction for everything else that involves a constitutional issue or federal law and sometimes state laws. Appellate jurisdiction means that a case starting in level 1 state or federal court can be appealed through the appeals process up to the highest court, if it survives, to the Supreme Court. And keep in mind, though, not all cases survive the appeals process, so it's not automatic that if you don't like the decision in a level 1 or level 2 court that you will get to the Supreme Court. But because the court has appellate jurisdiction, it can entertain cases that have been decided by lower courts. We will talk more about appeals in a different episode because I think that's sort of its own quagmire. So, Martin, now that you know the two types of jurisdiction that the Supreme Court has, or the two things that it can do, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess kind of just reiterating, it seems like they don't do what the original jurisdiction, and they really are just dealing in appeals. I think even earlier in my like definition of the Supreme Court, I said, yeah, they deal with appeals, because it seems like that's really maybe those are just the headline grabbing ones that we get nowadays. But it seems like that's what they do mostly is the latter.
I would venture a guess, and I would invite any of our listeners that are Supreme Court practitioners to correct us, but I would imagine that the vast majority is appellate jurisdiction type cases, and they may be few and far between, or it could just be that we don't hear about them, the cases where original jurisdiction is the basis for going straight to the Supremes. All right, we're back into Jeopardy mode. Martin, for 100 points, where is the actual Supreme Court?
In DC?
I wrote in my notes, I will accept Washington, D.C. So,
excuse me. What is in Washington, D.C.?
See, and the thing is,
I think I lost points there.
So you know what? I'm primed and ready to have Martin get all the points, right? But Martin has noticed that he did not answer in the form of a question. So if he was on Celebrity Jeopardy, it might be fine. But if he was on regular Jeopardy, those
That's
100 points might be lost. So because he's on Supreme Court 101 Jeopardy, he gets the 100 points. Because I wrote in my notes, I would accept Washington, D.C. But the actual address is 1 First Street Northeast, Washington, D.C., 20543. It's a kind of easy address when you think about it. 1 First Street. What do you think?
My initial reaction was, you thought I would know that? But
a lot of fun facts.
Yeah, I guess I do know some random fun facts. To your point, though, it is a very easy. What was it? 1 First Street.
See, you already have memorized it.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Great. We've got another one in store for you for 300 points. When is the Supreme Court in session? And I will make this easier. What month do you think they start in?
Don't they have multiple terms? My answer, though, if I had to guess, it's in the summertime, and then they adjourn, I think, for the summer. And I know that because of headlines of some major court cases and hearing like when decisions come out, which I think there's also some like fog around that in terms of that. I bet we'll probably get to it. So if I were to venture guess, what month? Since your prompt was not provided in the form of an answer, I'm not going to answer the form of a question. I would say June?
I feel like there's a lot of circumvention of Jeopardy rules, but the answer is also incorrect. And so, womp womp, no 300 points. It's a tricky question, though, because I think truly it's not necessarily a thing that your average person knows. I had some awareness based on legal practice, based on having been a litigator, but I had to refresh myself. So totally okay that you did not get this one. According to the Supreme Court's website, a term of the Supreme Court begins by statute on the first Monday in October. And usually court sessions continue until late June or early July. You were thinking about multiple terms.
And I think so part of that, I guess June is like the ending month.
I thought my question was when they started, and I think my question was pretty clear, but you knew something was happening in summer, and I think that's great because as an attuned and in touch layperson, you're recognizing that there's sort of media and buzz happening around the court becoming close to the end of their session, and people who've been watching important cases, they're often tracking and they're like, well, wait a minute, we haven't heard a decision on X versus blah, blah, blah. What's going to happen? The Supreme Court is almost in recess. So it's very clear that you are tracking. So good job. 0 points, but A for effort.
I think it's interesting that you expressed a little bit of pride in me knowing something was going on in summer. And that was kind of my thought process because I again, because I've seen it in headlines that there's decisions coming out in the summer. That's why my guess was June for the term to end. However, it's probably not a good thing that the average layperson knows. I feel like, I don't know, growing up, I felt like you shouldn't know, like you shouldn't have to know these things. But listeners, I think we really should be knowing these things.
Can't walk around without it. So, Martin, I'm also going to have you read some additional language from the Supreme Court's website because it may be that we have misconceptions about what's happening during the recess. So, Martin, I sent you some language, and I'd like you to read it for our listeners.
The court typically recesses at the end of June, but the work of the justices is unceasing. During the summer, they continue to analyze new petitions for review, consider motions and applications, and must make preparations for cases scheduled for fall argument.
Guess that leaves no time for lavish yacht rides, am I right?
Oh, not at all. None whatsoever.
I really wanted you to read that language so that I could deliver this joke.
You're setting it up, huh?
Probably a lot of people might get, even if they would not consider themselves law nerds, because so much has come up in the news about how judges spend their time and their money and money that we did not know that they received. So,
yeah, when I started to read, but the work of the justice is unceasing, I was like, oh my gosh. Not enough time to road trip in your $1 million RV.
Right. But that is the topic for another episode. And believe you me, listeners, we will get there. Next question for you, Martin. And this one is not a Jeopardy question because I wouldn't say it's an obscure question per se, but I did not know this until I looked it up. So I don't think it's fair to ask you to guess. How many cases get appealed to the Supreme Court? And how many do they accept?
I'd imagine hundreds yearly. I would venture to guess get petitioned to the Supreme Court was the phrasing.
I used appealed, but actually I think I like your phrasing better. Petitioned better.
So how many cases are petitioned to Supreme Court?
That was the first number, and then the second is how many do they actually
do? I would bet. Gosh, we're a litigious country too. I would bet. My gut was saying like 250. I feel like it's probably way more than that. Like people, I don't know, people just asking the Supreme Court to take it on, right? I'm gonna give my final answer. Since we're playing Who Wants to Be a Jeopardy lawyer and layman Supreme Court justice. I'll give final answer. Let's say 300 are requested for the Supreme Court to review, and I'd say like a dozen per term are actually accepted and reviewed.
Okay. interesting guesses. According to supremecourt.gov, and this is a resource I relied on heavily for this episode, the court receives approximately 7,000 to 8,000 petitions for writ of certiorari each term. We can even have an episode of how to pronounce that C word that I just said, because there's a debate about that. Anyway.
Certiorari? Was that? Is that the word?
Certiorari is how I say it.
Certiorari. Oh, okay.
Tomato, potato. The court grants and hears oral argument in about 80 cases. 80. Martin.
80. Wow.
You're better at me than math. 80 cases out of, let's say, 8,000 petitions is how many accepted? What would that percentage be?
Like 0.8%, I think.
Is
80
out of 8,000.
80 out of 8,000. Oh, it's like 0.1%.
Isn't it awesome we walk around with calculators in our pocket? Back in the day when we were in like...
Don't give out my secret here. Oh, 80 out of 8,000 is actually 1%. So
I knew you would have it pretty readily available.
Yeah, that was close. That's crazy. That is well. 8,000, 7,000 to 8,000 a year.
Correct.
Wow. If we extrapolate out, that's what, 20 cases a day almost?
You did say we're a litigious country, so that seems to hold up.
See, I kind of guessed a little bit lower, just thinking like, who has the gall from the Supreme Court? You know, like there definitely are, right? And I'm sure there are countless examples. However, who has the money and resources, you know, legal representation, and a case that has any, you know, a snowball's chance in hell in getting appealed? But I guess there's all sorts of angles, right?
You know, we're thinking about these numbers and seeing them as pretty stark, both how many petitions are submitted, but then how many cases are actually accepted. There's some slightly different data on the uscourts.gov website. So that's another government website that has information not just about the Supreme Court, but other U.S. federal courts. And that website says that the Supreme Court agrees to hear about 100 to 150 of the more than 7,000 cases that it is asked to review each year. So slightly different data on another government website.
Let's think ballpark. When you think about it, to October through June.
Yes.
So that's, let's say we could split the difference there between 80 and, would you say 120 something? Let's just say, just to make it a round easy number, since we're so good at math here, 90 cases over 9 months. That's 10 cases a month. It means what, 1.5 cases a week, which actually seems like a decent amount of work. Like
decent amount of work.
Like having a full blown case. That seems like a lot of work. And if it reaches the Supreme Court, like it should be pretty serious, and there's some fervent legal advocacy probably on both sides. Those poor Supreme Court clerks.
Truly. Excellent point. Listeners, if any of you are practitioners before the Supreme Court, we would love to know which of these figures are more accurate, the supremecourt.gov or the uscourts.gov data. I suspect the Supreme Court's own website is most accurate, but what do I know? I don't practice before the Supreme Court. Martin makes a great point, though. The numbers, the percentage are pretty close for both websites. Next question for you, Martin. What happens when the Supreme Court decides a case? How quickly does it happen? Both how long does it take to decide, but also how long does it take for their decision to take effect? So sort of a two-part question.
That's that's an interesting one. My guess on how long courts take, or how long a case in front of the Supreme Court takes. My guess is they do whatever they want, and cases can go as long as they want for a full term, get pushed to another term. That would be my opinion. If there's probably an average, I would guess like, a month, 4 weeks for a case. Like that seems pretty short too, but in theory, from my understanding, what I would assume, I guess, the issues that the Supreme Court focuses on are pretty focused and pretty narrow, but maybe not. And then how long does it take to take effect? Was the second part of that question. My guess would be torn between when the next term starts and when the decision is announced. I think it'd be when the next term starts because there are announcements, and from like really the past couple of years and the notoriety of the Supreme Court, I know that cases are decided and then they don't release them until the end of the term, and they can kind of trickle them out and control the release of the information, which is a scary thing. That, a legal decision can be made and it's decided, and only a small group of people actually know what is decided, what is decided law. So yeah, my two answers. One, as long as they want, they can kind of do whatever they want, / even push it to other terms. And then two, takes effect when the next term starts.
Okay. I mean, I think those are fairly solid theories. I am going to ask you to read some language that addresses the first part of the question, how quickly a decision is reached during the term. Martin, if you would read for our listeners.
Absolutely. All opinions of the court are typically handed down by the last day of the court's term, the day in late June or early July, when the court recesses for the summer. With the exception of this deadline, there are no rules concerning when decisions must be released. Typically, decisions that are unanimous are released sooner than those that have concurring and dissenting opinions. While some unanimous decisions are handed down as early as December, some controversial opinions, even if heard in October, may not be handed down until the last day of the term.
So I think that supports your theory. I mean, it's kind of up to the judges, but it also is a matter of whether or not the judges have agreed, right? So if all of the justices are on board and they are in agreement about a decision, it may take less time for them to have the unanimous opinion put together than if there's a strong sort of debate or disagreement among them. And then in terms of how long a case takes to become effective, Martin, you might think immediately, but there is, shocker, litigious country, an appeals process. Like all courts, the Supreme Court has a list of rules. And one of them, Rule 44, gives the parties 25 days to file a petition for rehearing, which would give them another chance at argument if granted. Any thoughts?
Yes. So yeah, I guess not surprising that the court kind of gets to decide whatever they want to do. And I kind of am on the fence. I kind of see it both ways in terms of how the decisions are released. Like, it makes sense that if there are unanimous decisions, like if everyone's working together, yeah, everyone's going to be happy with results. A lot easier. There's going to be less obstacles to releasing something. And realistically, if there is a controversial opinion, I think it's fair to allow the concurring and dissenting opinions some time to really be fully developed and articulated, because it's so important for these decisions to get down and for them to be explained clearly and for everyone to understand them. On the other hand, it's interesting how the court can play politics, and I think we've seen it, with Roberts' court with some notorious decisions that they have decided, and I think that's what I was saying about it being scary that they can release it whenever, is because they've made this choice and they have this huge amount of power, this small group of people, and they, it can impact literally everyone in the country. It's going to, because it should be settled case law and therefore a precedent, and like that's going to trickle down to every court law below it. And all of us walk around not knowing. And it's the antithesis of this podcast. It's just a scary thought that, something can be decided and this small group of people, the Supreme Court, the clerks and attorneys know about it, and they just want to hang on to it, for political purposes or whatever. It just doesn't quite feel right, but
most things that we discuss in our podcast will not feel quite right. But thank you for your thoughts, Martin, and for having this level of awareness. I think even the fact that you are pointing to concurring and dissenting opinions, which we will talk more about shortly, and allowing for there being the time for those to be written and for the positions to be sort of set forth in a way that makes sense so that the public / consumers of these opinions, whoever reads them, can understand what the actual rule is, what somebody thought maybe was the right outcome, but they had a different way of going about it, and then what somebody disagreed with. It's sort of helpful to give time for that whole process to play out. Next question for you, Martin. Where are cases found, Supreme Court cases? Any guesses or thoughts?
Like physically where are they found, or?
Great clarifying question. Sure.
In like Congress Hall of Records or something? I feel like if we were talking about like physical documentation, because I imagine Supreme Court still prints out paper and signs physical documents and that sort of thing. Like if it's not within the halls of the Supreme Court itself, I feel like it'd be like Hall of Congress or some sort of like federal document keeping location.
That's an excellent guess. And that's very much sort of the essence of what happens for the physical publication. We'll talk about the sort of where you can electronically get opinions too, because yay, we live in an era where you don't just have to get the paper copies. So the formal official publication happens in something called the United States Reports, and this is required by law. So when you're looking at a Supreme Court case and you see a number followed by US and then another number, that tells you where in the US reports, the physical volume, that the opinion can be found. The first number is the volume number, and then the US means US reports. Then the second number is the page number. The Supreme Court also makes their opinions available on the court website for free. That is supremecourt.gov. And another place that folks could go is Justia, JUSTIA.com, another free resource. I'll also note that lawyers at law firms and other organizations often have paid access to research resources like LexisNexis and Westlaw, which have many other tools and analyses. When I was practicing at a firm, I basically lived on Westlaw and LexisNexis, so I got very familiar with them and what they could do. What do you think, Martin? Did you know about all these resources for where you can get Supreme Court opinions?
I feel like LexisNexis, is that one of them? I feel like you've mentioned that one before, but no, I thought it's kind of cool. Like it's interesting, and as maybe also a history nerd, not just a law nerd, the fact that the numbers correspond to physically where the documentation lies, like that's kind of cool. Did not know that. But yeah, did not know that there are these like many legitimate sources for the court's opinions. And I think it's great that nowadays any one of us could access it if you have like an internet connection, essentially.
Martin, the next question I have for you is, what is the structure of a Supreme Court case? Any guesses? Like, how would you organize a case if you were a member of the highest court in the land?
Ooh. Gosh, I've got nothing because I have no idea how like an actual court case has a basic structure. But stealing from like Hollywood tropes and maybe Law and Order, there's probably start with the appellant, and they would have their opening statement. Then I don't know the opposite of the appellant, but then the other person would have an opening statement. They both have their arguments, and then closing statements.
You're making me realize that I did not ask the question that I intended to ask. I liked your answer though, and I feel like a lot of what you said makes sense. And the arts often borrow from fact, right? So at least some of what we see, not everything, of course, but some of what we see in the Law and Orders, etc., borrows from the real life structure of how cases and oral arguments work. What I meant to ask was, what is the structure of a Supreme Court opinion? So my apologies. I also want to respond to your, what is the opposite of appellant question? That would be appellee. And again, we'll talk about that.
Of course, yeah. I was going to say, which also, it kind of sounds like just from basic, like from understanding the English and kind of the Latin Greek root words. I feel like the appellee would be the person who, like, maybe it's because there's like, it kind of ends with like a plea, even though it's different spelling. Like an appellee kind of sounds like somebody who has a grievance. But I don't. I mean, I also kind of gets confusing probably between the different appeals courts and the way that it makes its way up to the Supreme Court, which I think maybe we're getting into too. But anyway, thank you for that piece of
course. And again, we will dive deeper into how appeals work. Probably bring in a guest who actually does appeals, but we'll talk more because there's so much more to unpack in terms of how they work. But what I wanted, it looks like Martin has something to say, so. Please, what's on your mind?
I was gonna jump in and say. So your question was, what is the structure of a Supreme Court opinion?
Yes, thoughts.
Okay, this I feel like I am much less well versed in answering because you typically don't see opinions read in movies or on TV. Okay, so if I wanted to feel like I was some fancy high court and trying to be, the exemplary court. My opinion, I would cut to the chase. I'd say, hey, here's the decision. Here's who wins essentially, and then you give probably like your summary of like what the decision was essentially, and then. Again, I guess I am trying. I guess I do kind of know just because, again, Supreme Court cases have been in headlines. So I think we kind of, I don't know. I feel like at least our generation really has grown up with some major Supreme Court cases. Maybe I'm severely discounting because there's, like I could imagine your parents, both of our parents, all of our parents, like lived through some major stuff. But anyway, so yes, there would also be time for concurring and dissenting opinions.
Okay, I think that's great, and it sounds like you would probably keep it to a page to just give the people what they need to know. Something short, right?
Oh, ideally, yes, but also because I am the host of this podcast, and in the last episodes, you mentioned there are like hundreds of pages.
Yes,
it's also, I feel like that is more on the nose for law. Like if you really like where my answer started out, if you really want to be this fanciful, we're the highest court in the land, law I feel like is it uses intentionally complicated language because the issues are complicated and you want to be specific and very clear and definite in what is being decided. But I think there's also some sprinkling of, oh, we're so important, we're gonna make this tough.
I think there is maybe some of that, maybe not said in that way, but the idea that the people who have gotten these fancy legal degrees and worked in fancy legal places, being the ones who are making these decisions, are probably not going to write one-page opinions, both because the things before them are super important, but also because they're like, well, I have this immense vocabulary and awareness of cases, and I need to walk the reader through all of that. Now, Martin, I know you're super curious about what exactly is in one of these long-winded opinions and what the justices claim to be walking the reader through, but that's all we have time for this episode. Join us next time for part 2 of Supreme Court 101, where we'll walk through the anatomy of a Supreme Court opinion. After listening to our next episode, you'll be able to impress your friends with a new party trick, explaining the parts of a Supreme Court opinion. I feel like that definitely 100% gives Schoolhouse Rock vibes, right? Maybe, Martin?
I'm just a nerd. Yeah, I'm a law nerd.
On Capitol Hill.
On one first way, or whatever the street was. In the meantime, you can reach out to us on Lawyer and Layman Pod on Instagram, LawyerandLaymanPod@gmail.com, and Lawyer Layman pretty much everywhere else. And as always, don't walk around not knowing.